Less than 6 months after his humiliating defeat in California, Nixon appeared on the Jack Paar Show, playing a tune he had written himself. Although no one in the audience could have known it, this was the beginning of one of the most remarkable comebacks in American political history.
Can Kennedy be defeated in '64?
Well, which one? Just to be very serious, I know, of course, you're referring to President Kennedy, and I, under no circumstances, would speak disrespectfully even of him or of his office.
Aren't you kind of friends? Weren't you kind of friends at one time?
Oh, certainly. We came to the Congress together.
I know you
and
were.
We were low men on the totem pole in the Labor Committee together. And we remained low men until he ran for president. Now he's up and I'm down.
My little daughter said today that, you know, she says, Miss Nixon, I'll be honest with you. Yeah, she says, I do hope that man finds work.
Nixon found work as a Wall Street lawyer, determined to succeed at what he called the fast track. Pat Nixon had never been happy with the constant demands of politics and welcomed the prospect of a more normal existence. "I hope we never move again," she told him when they settled in New York. But politics had been Nixon's whole life, all he had ever known. He soon told friends he would die of boredom if he stayed in private life.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas.
To some, it seemed that Kennedy's assassination might open the way for Nixon in the next election. But sensing the mood of the country, Nixon concluded that Lyndon Johnson, the new president, would be unbeatable in 1964.
Are you writing yourself off at this point as a political candidate or as a presidential candidate at any time?
Well, I made it clear that I am not a candidate for public office. I shall not become a candidate in this year, 1964, and I certainly have no plans to become a candidate in the future. I also want to make it clear at the same time, however, I'm not writing myself off as a political leader in the United States.
As Nixon expected, President Johnson overwhelmed Republican Barry Goldwater in 1964, and the party lost disastrously in Congress. But in the ruins of that defeat, Nixon saw his way back to power. He worked the Republican congressional circuit tirelessly, traveled to 35 states, barnstormed for 105 candidates. And when the party made a dramatic comeback in 1966, there was hardly a Republican who didn't owe Nixon a favor.
He was uncomfortable with all of the obligatory activities of politics. Those were the dues one paid in order to gain admission to the arena. And he paid them. He flinched on occasion, but he paid them. He learned to do what he had to do.
Hey, how you doing, boy? Good to see you. Good to see you. Get this boy in now. We're going to. No, this is your old district. You get him in now. We're going to get him in.
Nixon promised his family a moratorium on politics in 1967, but immediately took off on a grueling tour of 4 continents. Traveling as a private citizen, the former vice president could still command a crowd in the most remote reaches of the globe. His trips kept him in the news and strengthened his grasp of foreign policy. Once again, Richard Nixon was aiming for the presidency.
He had this absolutely core fire that he wanted to be president of the United States. I think for several reasons, probably to prove a lot of things to himself, but also because he sincerely wanted to take the country in a direction that he felt was the right direction.
Okay.
As Nixon officially announced his candidacy in February 1968, the events of that tumultuous year moved him closer to the office he had sought for so long. In Vietnam, communist guerrillas fought their way to the very doorstep of the American embassy in Saigon. Never had the prospects for victory looked more bleak. At home, anger over the war tore the country apart and forced Lyndon Johnson to withdraw from the presidential race. Robert Kennedy was just beginning to emerge as the Democratic frontrunner when he was killed by an assassin's bullet. Race riots following the murder of Martin Luther King turned many cities into battlegrounds. The country had not suffered such upheaval since the Civil War. Many Americans yearned for a leader who promised safety and stability.
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire.
In Miami Beach, safe from the crises that engulfed the country, the Nixon family watched as Republicans chose their candidate.
For Richard M. Nixon.
There, we work for those.
Wisconsin is proud to cast its 30 votes for the nominee of this convention, Richard M. Nixon.
Sit down, get to work.
As he accepted the nomination of his party, Nixon offered himself as the man who could bring order out of the turmoil of 1968.
When the strongest nation in the world can be tied down for 4 years in a war in Vietnam with no end in sight, when the nation with the greatest tradition of the rule of law is plagued by unprecedented lawlessness, when a nation has been known for a century for equality of opportunity is torn by unprecedented racial violence, then it's time for new leadership for the United States of America.
Republicans once again pinned their presidential hopes on Richard Nixon. To them and to many in the press, he seemed a new Nixon, better prepared than the man who had lost in 1960. But the Democratic frontrunner Hubert Humphrey said he'd seen it all before.
They started the renewal job in 1952. Brand new Nixon. There was some reason for it, too. Then they had another renewal job in 1956. Then they had another renovation operation in 1960. Then when he went to run for governor in California in 1962, they renewed him again. And then in 1964, another touch-up. And now I read about the new Nixon of 1968. Ladies and gentlemen, anybody that had his political face lifted so many times can't be very new.
Boating in the Florida Keys, Nixon was relaxed and confident. He was running far ahead of Humphrey in the polls, and the Vietnam War was splintering the Democrats. At their convention in Chicago, the anti-war wing of the party pressed for an end to the bombing and a negotiated withdrawal of U.S. troops. But Humphrey stuck by President Johnson's policy.
And I think that withdrawal would be totally unrealistic and would be a catastrophe.
As the Democrats fought over Vietnam, Nixon avoided the issue, promising only that he would find an honorable end to the war. Along with millions of Americans, he watched on television as anti-war protests outside the convention hall exploded into violence. In the chaos, Nixon saw an opportunity. A few days later, he moved through the same streets in a motorcade. 400,000 people turned out to cheer him. He chose the city which had seen open war among the Democrats to sound one of the central themes of his campaign.
The nation of laws, and as Abraham Lincoln has said, no one is above the law, no one is below the law, and we're going to enforce the law, and Americans should remember that if we're going to have law and order.
The emphasis on law and order appealed to millions of Americans. Nixon's television commercials hammered it home.
In recent years, crime in this country has grown 9 times as fast as population. At the current rate, the crimes of violence in America will double by 1972. We cannot accept that kind of future for America. We owe it to the decent and law-abiding citizens of America to take the offensive against the criminal forces that threaten their peace and their security, and to rebuild respect for law across this country. I pledge to you the way...
To the Democrats, Nixon's call for law and order played to the worst in Americans.
But you can't vote your anger. You have to vote your hopes. You can't vote your hates. You have to vote your hopes.
The preamble to the Constitution doesn't just say double the rate of convictions. It doesn't just say law and order. It says to ensure justice. And if Mr. Nixon hasn't read it, then I'll send him a copy.
But Nixon had a feel for the issues that moved the middle American voter. They were the same issues that moved him. Blaming liberal Democrats for the upheaval in the country, he sought to rally a new Republican majority.
A new voice that is being heard across America today. It is not the voice of a single person. It's the voice of a majority of Americans who have not been the protesters, who have not been the shouters. The great majority finally have become angry. Not angry with hate, but angry, my friends, because they love America and they don't like what has been happening to America for the last 4 years.
You've just heard Richard Nixon refer to you, among all these other people, as the forgotten Americans. What do you think he's referring to?
Well, I sort of think he's talking about the people that are paying the taxes, that are supporting the schools, the churches, the people that they are sort of forgotten because everything's aimed at welfare and things like that.
Nixon's call to the forgotten Americans appealed to a broad band of voters, mostly white, middle class, hawkish, patriotic. It was a group that felt ignored and excluded in the upheavals of the 60s. And the strategy seemed to be working. Nixon held his strong lead into the fall. Then, just before the election, President Johnson suddenly stopped the bombing of North Vietnam. Humphrey surged in the polls.
We're going to have the biggest election surprise that America's known in 20 years. We're going to win this election. Thank you very much.
By election night, Nixon and Humphrey were dead even. Nixon prepared his family for the possibility of still another defeat.
You see that Nixon has closed a little bit in the last few tabulations there.
I think before the morning is out, Hubert Humphrey will be the next president of the United States.
And there have been no changes. None of those big states have fallen yet that the ones we are waiting for. And Nixon has 175.
All night long, the lead shifted back and forth. The results weren't announced until 8 the next morning.
With the 26 electoral votes in Illinois, Richard Nixon goes over the top with 287 electoral votes. He needed 270 to win, and that seems to be the 1968 election.
And he is beaming, Pat Nixon is beaming. One can't help but think back to 1960 when a tearful Pat Nixon was choking back the emotions. It was a totally different scene, of course, then. Here is possibly one of the most fantastic political comebacks in American history.
I saw many signs in this campaign. Some of them were not friendly. Some were very friendly. But the one that touched me the most was one that I saw in Dexter, Ohio, at the end of a long day of whistle stopping. A teenager held up the sign, "Bring us together." And that will be the great objective of this administration at the outset, to bring the American people together.
Nixon spoke of unity, but his margin of victory had been extremely narrow. He had not reached out to blacks, or the poor, or opponents of the war. And a nation as badly divided as America in 1968 would not be easy to lead. At age 56, after 22 years of political battle, Richard Nixon had become the most powerful man in the world. He envisioned nothing less than a new world order, with himself as its architect.
The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. This honor now beckons America. If we succeed, generations to come will say of us now living that we mastered our moment, that we helped make the world safe for mankind. This is our summons to greatness.
There's no question at all that Nixon aspired to greatness. He would talk constantly about the generation of peace that he hoped to contribute to building, that would indeed be his bequest to the United States and the world.
As Nixon took power, he assembled a staff that would leave him free to carry out his ambitious plans, and whose loyalty had already been demonstrated.
The White House staff, as it evolves, I think you'll find will be smaller than it's been in the past.
H.R. Haldeman, a former advertising executive who had been at Nixon's side since 1956, was made chief of staff. He was proud, he once said, to be Richard Nixon's John Ehrlichman, a lawyer and top aide during the campaign, would handle much of domestic policy. Together, he and Haldeman would tightly control access to the president. Those whom they excluded called them the Berlin Wall. Behind that wall, Nixon could focus on his main interest, foreign policy, bypassing the State Department to work closely with his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger.
Dr. Kissinger is perhaps one of the major scholars in America and the world today in this area. He has never yet had a full-time government assignment, and he will bring to this responsibility a fresh approach.
They organize the government to concentrate power in the hands of these two men in the White House. And it's not accidental that he appoints an old friend but a decidedly weak practitioner in Bill Rogers in the Department of State, or essentially a Wisconsin Dells politician, Melvin Laird, as Secretary of Defense. There are no strong figures in this cabinet, and there are no strong foreign policy figures anywhere in the higher echelons of the government. It is to be Richard Nixon's foreign policy, and it is to be carried out with sophistication and some subtlety by Henry Kissinger.
Looming over the new administration was the war in Vietnam. American troops had been fighting for 4 years on behalf of South Vietnam against the Soviet-backed communist forces of the North. The war had already taken the lives of 30,000 Americans and over 1 million Vietnamese, and destroyed one president. Nixon was determined not to let it destroy him. Even before his inauguration, Nixon had Kissinger begin secret contacts with the North Vietnamese in an attempt to move the stalled Paris peace talks forward. And soon the two men developed a strategy they hoped would get the U.S. out of the war, without abandoning America's ally, South Vietnam.
We have adopted a plan which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly, scheduled timetable. This withdrawal will be made from strength.
Confident that this policy would end America's involvement in Southeast Asia by the end of 1970, Nixon and Kissinger turned their attention to global strategy, reshaping America's entire relationship with the communist world.
They both begin in 1969-1970 with a notion that only lately has become fashionable in Washington, and that is that the post-war is really over, that the Cold War ought to be a thing of the past. They are, in that sense, almost 20 years ahead of their time.
Recognizing that the Soviet Union had nearly caught up to the U.S. in nuclear strength, Nixon and Kissinger dispatched a team of negotiators to work out a treaty with the Soviets. For the first time in the history of the nuclear age, the two superpowers sat down to discuss setting limits on nuclear weapons. At the same time, they began secret contacts with the other great communist power, China. There were few more forbidding and isolated places in the world in 1969, but Nixon believed that China, with its vast population and growing nuclear arsenal, would soon be too powerful to ignore.
Here, for the first time in the 20th century, we have two men at the very pinnacle of the American government who have some clear notion, not only of what the world is doing out there, what's happening in the world, but of where they want the United States to fit in. We are not a nation that practices its foreign policy by design, for the most part, and Nixon and Kissinger are an exception to that rule.
In the summer of 1969, Nixon announced the first American troop withdrawals from Vietnam. Arms control, China, Southeast Asia. He seemed to be moving steadily toward becoming a peacemaker. Richard Nixon loved the movie Patton and watched it again and again in the White House. General George Patton was a man of action, contemptuous of his critics, uncompromising, determined to win at all costs.
You seated? I want you to remember, Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Because the very thought of losing is hateful to America.
Richard Nixon was determined not to be the first American president to lose a war. He might simply have brought the troops home and blamed Vietnam on the Democrats. But Nixon, like many of his contemporaries in both parties, believed that abandoning South Vietnam to the communists would be a defeat that invited further aggression, a sign that America could no longer be counted on by her allies. Despite mounting pressure for immediate withdrawal, he stuck to his gradual course while trying to negotiate what he called an honorable end to the war. But the months dragged on, casualties mounted, and Nixon's policy seemed only to prolong America's agony.
I said, with respect to Vietnam, I said, war in Vietnam is lost. And the sooner you get out, the better we will be. It was lost, but he, for some reason, kept at it. It wasn't his war. And it seemed to me that just handling a presidency, you stick around with a war for 2 years and it's your war. And it became his war. And in the end, half the country seemed to think he started it.
All we are saying is give peace a chance.
In October 1969, the largest anti-war demonstrations in the nation's history, collectively known as the Moratorium, were held in cities all over the country. Critics of the war had waited 9 months for Nixon to make good his pledge to end the conflict. But now the honeymoon was over.
I understand that there has been and continues to be opposition to the war in Vietnam on the campuses and also in the nation. As far as this kind of activity is concerned, We expect it. However, under no circumstances will I be affected whatever by it.
The moratorium itself was seen by Richard Nixon as 200,000 people out there on the mall protesting his foreign policy, while at the same time the polls were showing that 58, 59% of the American people supported him in his foreign policy. And he would look out the window and he would say, I simply cannot permit foreign policy to be made in the streets of Washington.
The President of the United States said nothing you young kids would do would have any effect on him. Well, I suggest to the President of the United States, if he want to know how much effect you youngsters can have on the President, he should make one long-distance phone call to the LBJ Ranch and ask that boy how much effect you can have.
1, 2, 3, 4, 50 days from the war.
The fate of Lyndon Johnson did haunt Richard Nixon. He felt he had to demonstrate that most Americans still supported him and that it would not benefit Hanoi to stall peace negotiations. Don't get rattled. Don't waver. Don't react, he told himself as he went to work on a speech to respond to the protests. Insisting on writing it himself, he distinguished his supporters, the forgotten Americans, from the vocal minority in the streets with a new catchphrase.
To you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
It was the most effective speech of Nixon's presidency. 80,000 telegrams and letters arrived at the White House. Nearly all supported him. His approval rating soared. But the war continued, and with it the protests.
I think Richard Nixon came to office expecting, if not a quick fix in Vietnam, expecting a kind of responsiveness in the war. He had made certain speeches, he had offered certain gestures, he had proffered both secretly and publicly what he thought were promising initiatives in negotiations. None of that had yielded anything. There was a palpable sense of frustration in the administration about how long this war was going to drag on. Out of the Oval Office began to flood memoranda that were stream of consciousness, renditions of the president's fears and ambitions in Southeast Asia. His image of this whole contest as a kind of challenge being issued not only by the parties on the ground, by the Cambodian rebels and the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, but ultimately by more formidable and distant forces, the Soviet Union, by China, by his enemies, testing him, measuring his mettle as a man and as a leader.
He took me aside and he said, I'm going to be out of the play for 10 days here. I won't be able to handle any domestic decisions for 10 days. So come back this afternoon and tell me all the things that need to be decided for the next 10 days, and then I won't be able to see you because I'm going to be focusing on this business in Vietnam. We're going to try and bring it to a head.
At the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Laird waited for the president. After days of tense deliberation, Nixon was about to announce an attack on enemy sanctuaries across the Vietnam border in Cambodia, and he would do so over the objections of many White House advisors.
We thought the invasion was a bad idea, and that it was one more round of escalation on the pattern, on an old pattern in Vietnam, which would cost lives and national treasure and really only prolong the suffering and do nothing to affect the larger outcome of the war.
But the military and Kissinger recommended the action, and Nixon wanted to go ahead. He was convinced that destroying the North Vietnamese hiding places in Cambodia would relieve communist pressure on the South. and he wanted to take some dramatic action to demonstrate that neither Hanoi nor the anti-war movement could intimidate the United States or its president.
If, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation, the United States of America, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world. It is not our power, but our will and character that is being tested tonight.
As Nixon spoke, American troops moved into Cambodia. His critics were outraged. The president who had promised to end the war seemed to be widening it, moving into a country perceived as neutral. 3 members of Kissinger's staff, including Roger Morris, resigned in protest. Nixon was unmoved.
I would rather be a one-term president and do what I believe was right than to be a 2-term president at the cost of seeing America become a second-rate power and to see this nation accept the first defeat in its proud 190-year history.
Early the next morning, Nixon went to the Pentagon for a first-hand briefing. The military was reporting success. Nixon was encouraged and praised American soldiers fighting in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The wife of one of those soldiers reached out to shake his hand. Nixon drew a sharp contrast between the troops in Vietnam and the student protesters at home.
You know, you see these bums, you know, blowing up the campuses. Listen, the boys that are on the college campuses today are the luckiest people in the world. And here they are burning up the books. I mean, storming around about this issue. I mean, you name it. Get rid of the war, there'll be another one.
Nixon's remarks further infuriated students already protesting over Cambodia. After 3 tense days of demonstrations at Kent State University in Ohio, nervous National Guardsmen opened fire. 4 students were killed. "My child was not a bum," said the father of one dead girl. American campuses exploded. Hundreds of colleges and universities closed down. Governors in 16 states called out the police and National Guard. Nixon's supporters took to the streets as well. At New York City Hall, construction workers struggled to raise the flag which the mayor had lowered to honor the dead at Kent State. Nixon's move into Cambodia and his dividing of Americans into bums and heroes had set off a national firestorm. Angry protesters returned to Washington. As tensions rose, the Secret Service ringed the White House with a barricade of buses.
It was like living in a bunker in the White House. I mean, you'd look out in the streets and see thousands of people protesting. You literally were afraid for your life. There were times when I can remember saying, I can't believe this is the United States of America, a free country. And here we are in the White House with barricades up and buses around the White House and tear gas going off and thousands, hundreds of thousands of protesters out in the streets and troops sitting here.
An embattled Nixon faced the press as anti-war demonstrators continued to flock to Washington.
Captain.
What do you think the students are trying to say in these demonstrations?
They're trying to say that they want peace. They're trying to say that they want to stop the killing. They're trying to say that they want to end the draft. They're trying to say that we ought to get out of Vietnam. I agree with everything that they're trying to accomplish. I believe, however, that the decisions that I have made will serve that purpose.
That night, protesters circled the White House with chants and candles. Inside, a sleepless Nixon made more than 40 phone calls to friends and supporters around the country. Near dawn, he called for a car and asked to be driven to the Lincoln Memorial, where protesters had gathered. White House aide Eagle Krogh followed him.
It was, I guess it was almost a surreal atmosphere. It was almost like dreamlike. Is this really happening? Walking up the stairs of the Lincoln Memorial, and there was the president, sort of standing in the middle of a group of young people who were wearing combat fatigues with peace symbols and bandanas and with all of the clothing of the 60s and the 70s, and trying very hard to communicate to them.
I think I said, well, what are you going to do about the Kent State killings? What are you going to do about the war? He said, I'm really not here to talk about that right now. We're trying to handle things. So it was a one-way, conversation or a one-way street, because he was there trying to be very conversational and casual, and we were there outraged and angry and scared.
One student basically told him, he said, I hope that you realize that we are willing to die for what we believe in. And I think, as I recall, the president's response was, well, I understand that, but we're trying to build a world where people will not have to die for what they believe in.
When he appeared as the guest of honor at a Billy Graham crusade in Tennessee, Nixon had been in office 16 months. A majority of Americans still backed his Vietnam policy, but the furor over Cambodia had deepened the divisions Nixon had promised to mend. Even here, surrounded by thousands who supported him, the president could not escape the ceaseless storm of protest.
If we're going to bring people together, as we must bring them together, if we're going to have peace in the world, if our young people are going to have a fulfillment beyond simply those material things, they must turn to those great spiritual sources that have made America the great country that it is. I'm proud to be here, and I'm very proud to have your warm reception. Thank you very much.
Let us sing together, God Bless America, My Home, Sweet Home. God bless America.
Throughout the next year, Nixon continued to try to rally his supporters while denouncing his opponents, calling some among the protesters thugs and hoodlums, blaming his critics in Congress and the press for failing to support the war. All U.S. troops left Cambodia by the end of June, as Nixon had promised. He insisted that the military action which had caused such turmoil had eased the pressure on the troops in Vietnam. Withdrawals continued on schedule, but more American lives had been lost. There was no breakthrough in the peace talks. And in the White House, an increasingly frustrated and suspicious Nixon urged intensified surveillance of the anti-war movement. He grew distrustful even of his closest advisors and installed hidden microphones in his own office, in part so that his aides could not later claim to have disagreed with his decisions. But the taping system would eventually trap the president himself. On June 12, 1971, the White House staff prepared for a wedding in the Rose Garden. The president's elder daughter, Tricia, was to be married to a young law student, Edward Cox. Rain threatened the ceremony, and Nixon spent much of the afternoon on the phone to Air Force weathermen. Finally, there was a prediction of a 15-minute break in the weather.
I gotta get dressed. I gotta get, let's see, all my things, my hair done, and so forth.
I saw the president more relaxed and more happy and more like a typical American father than I've seen him in a long, long time.
He looked like he was doing a great job out on the dance floor, too.
Yes, and he doesn't dance all that often, you know.
It was a day that all of us will remember, Nixon later wrote, because we were beautifully and simply happy. The next morning, Nixon picked up the New York Times. In the left corner was an account of Tricia's wedding. Across the page was another headline: the first installment of what came to be called the Pentagon Papers, a secret Defense Department study which revealed past government deception about the war in Vietnam. Daniel Ellsberg, a former Defense Department employee who had turned against the war, had given the top-secret documents to the press.
I can no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public.
Although the Pentagon Papers contained nothing about the Nixon policy in Vietnam, it was a leak of enormous magnitude. The President and Henry Kissinger saw it as a disturbing precedent and a threat to their secret diplomacy.
There was panic in the White House. And I remember being in meetings with Henry Kissinger that day in which he said this could cause the collapse of American foreign policy. This could undermine our initiatives with China and the Soviet Union. And don't forget that at that time, people did not know that we were negotiating secretly with the Chinese. They did not also know that we were conducting secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese to end the war in Vietnam. And so a lot of things were going on that we knew that the public didn't.
Just 5 weeks later, the Times published another leak, this one potentially damaging to Nixon's foreign policy. It revealed U.S. negotiating tactics in upcoming arms talks with the Soviets, and it seemed to confirm Nixon's worst fears about the press.
I had seen him angry in meetings in the past, but I had never experienced this kind of fury where he was basically walking around the room, slamming his fist in his hand, saying that this cannot be tolerated. We cannot let this go on.
Nixon became obsessive about the press coverage. We had a daily news summary that was prepared by a young man in the White House. By the time I got to the White House, the president had already read it and had marked on the columns. John Chancellor last night said this: respond today, call up so-and-so, look at this, you can't trust these people. Newsweek has done it to us again. I'd get Nixon's news summary with all these comments down the side. And so you had the idea when you went to work in the morning you were going to war with the press.
A sense of being under siege pervaded the White House, fueled by the leaks, the constant anti-war demonstrations, and intensifying criticism in the press. In this atmosphere of us versus them, Colson's office began an ever-expanding list of Nixon's critics, the enemies list. Its object was to screw our political enemies. Reporters and politicians, educators and entertainers were barred from the White House. Some were targeted for tax audits. Others were trailed by private detectives.
And it was very shortly thereafter that Nixon authorized the plumbers, the creation of a special group to stop leaks, and they began to take extra legal steps and put into motion the mechanism which ultimately resulted in the downfall of the administration.
In a White House memo regarding the neutralization of Daniel Ellsberg, the plumbers discussed how they might destroy his public image and credibility. In search of damaging information about Ellsberg's private life, they arranged a break-in at the office of his psychiatrist.
They apparently broke a window on the way in, and realizing that it could no longer be viewed as a covert operation, changed courses and decided to make it look as if it had been entered by a burglar looking for drugs or some other substances. Basically, they smashed up the office, took pictures of the damage. I was shocked at these pictures. Went to see John Ehrlichman. He was, if anything, more shocked than I was, and said, shut it down as of now.
The plumbers were eventually disbanded, but some of the agents were reassigned to work behind the scenes for the newly formed committee to re-elect the president. Re-election had become Nixon's consuming concern. From the first day of his presidency, he had fought to hold on to his silent majority and had shaped his domestic policies in part to win their votes. But those voters were slipping away. Unemployment and inflation were up. Racial divisions had deepened. And still, week after week, the dead came home from Vietnam. Nixon's popularity had fallen so low that he had begun to fear he would not even be renominated in 1972.
Good evening. The 37th President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon, is in China, the first American chief executive ever to visit the world's most populous country.
On February 18, 1972, Richard Nixon began still another remarkable comeback with a stunning foreign policy success.
President Nixon's motorcade is now sweeping toward the city of Peking.
Here comes the motorcade now, as you see.
The world watched as Richard Nixon drove through a city that few outsiders had seen for nearly a quarter of a century. He knew, said the New York Times, that for this journey, no matter what else occurred, he would always be remembered. That afternoon, Nixon was abruptly summoned to see Mao Zedong. American television was unaware of the meeting. The only coverage was by Chinese cameramen with black and white film. This encounter between Nixon, the career anti-communist, and Chairman Mao, the leader of the largest communist revolutionary movement in history, shocked Nixon's old conservative allies. They accused him of surrendering to international communism. But for Nixon, it was all part of his global strategy. By visiting China, he was beginning to exploit the divisions in the communist world.
One of Nixon's primary objectives in opening up with China was to give him more leverage with the Soviet Union. These relations were essentially stalled, but soon after the opening with China, the Soviet Union became much more flexible in several fronts. They agreed to a summit meeting with us in 1972, and they began to be more reasonable in various arms control issues.
Nixon enjoyed the power game, probably as much as any president in modern times. He played it very hard and very cleverly and very carefully in the world scene. And he was always thinking strategically, and that's one of the qualities that someone has to have in foreign policy. I mean, you cannot make decisions in foreign policy based on today's circumstance. You've got to think about its ramifications for 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And it's like a chess player. You're anticipating 6 moves ahead if you're a good chess player.
In the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese suddenly launched a massive offensive. South Vietnam's forces were overwhelmed. Thousands fled. If the offensive were not stopped, the war would be lost, and with it, Nixon feared the presidency. But if he ordered a U.S. counterattack, the Soviets might cancel the upcoming arms control summit in Moscow, a vital part of Nixon's grand design. Most of his advisors urged Nixon not to take any action that might jeopardize the summit. Once again, Nixon overruled them.
His view was that it would be embarrassing for him to go to Moscow without responding to North Vietnamese aggression, that he would look weak. He's talking to Soviet leaders who are providing arms to the North Vietnamese troops who are killing American troops. So he didn't think the summit was worth it unless he could also show that he was strong within Vietnam itself.
Nixon ordered the most drastic escalation of the war since 1968. Massive, sustained bombing of Hanoi and the mining of Haiphong Harbor, risking a full-scale confrontation with the Soviets by putting their supply ships in peril. After explaining his decision to the American people, he made a direct appeal to the Kremlin.
Our two nations have made significant progress in our negotiations in recent months. We are near major agreements on nuclear arms limitation, on trade, on a host of other issues. Let us not slide back toward the dark shadows of a previous age. We do not ask you to sacrifice your principles or your friends, but neither should you permit Hanoi's intransigence to blot out the prospects we together have so patiently prepared.
Nixon's gamble paid off. The Soviets did not cancel the summit. On May 22, 1972, Richard Nixon became the first American president ever to set foot inside the Kremlin. Nixon had done what none of his predecessors had been able to do. He had negotiated a treaty in which the two superpowers agreed to slow an arms race that had been accelerating for more than a quarter of a century. It was his greatest achievement. Two days later, 5 burglars working for the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon entered the Watergate complex in Washington. They broke into the office of the Democratic National Committee, placed bugs on the telephones, and made their escape. But the microphones failed to work. They would have to go back.
The President of the United States.
Nixon returned from Moscow in triumph. He had almost completed the withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam, opened the door to China, and signed the first nuclear arms limitation treaty since the dawn of the atomic age. He had often said that all he wanted was a life with one more victory than defeat. Now that victory, a second term as president, seemed his for the asking.
5 men wearing white gloves and carrying cameras were caught early today in the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in Washington. They apparently were unarmed, and nobody knows yet why they were there. But I don't think that's the last we're going to hear of this story.